Pokémon is the highest grossing media franchise of all time, bigger than Mickey Mouse, Star Wars, Marvel, and every other entertainment franchise in history. However, this video is not about Pokémon as a whole, but the development and the story behind the creation of the mainline Pokémon games. So buckle in, get some snacks, and let's take a look at the story of the Pokémon video game franchise. The story of the first Pokémon game begins in 1990, when Game Freak pitched the idea of a Pokémon game to Nintendo. Game Freak started out as a video game magazine made by Satoshi Tajiri and his friend, a talented artist named Ken Sugimori. The magazine later turned into an actual game development company. A few years later, they were joined by Junichi Masuda as the composer, who basically gathered all his music, showed up at Tajiri's apartment, and was hired on the spot. Their first game was Mendel Palace, also known as Quinty in Japan. It wasn't a huge success, but it was a start. Tajiri, however, had always loved collecting bugs, even being called Dr. Bug as a kid, and he liked shows like Ultraman where they used giant creatures stored in small capsules to fight enemies. When the Game Boy Link cable was announced, he imagined creatures moving through that cable from one device to another, and that sparked the idea of Pokémon, a game about catching creatures and trading them with friends. Tajiri pitched the idea to Nintendo, but the big bosses didn't really understand it. They were sure it would not work. However, Shigeru Miyamoto, creator of Mario and Zelda, became interested in the project. He could see that there was something special and unique. He mentored Tajiri and eventually convinced Nintendo to fund the project. And so began the longest development period of any Pokémon game, lasting 6 long years. Game Freak ran out of money constantly while making Pokémon Red and Green. 5 employees quit because the company couldn't pay them properly. Tajiri didn't even take a salary himself and lived off his father's income just to survive. By 1995, Tajiri even considered quitting. But that's when Tsunekazu Ishihara founded a company called Creatures Inc. and made a deal. Creatures would invest money into Game Freak to finish Pokémon Red and Green, and in exchange, Creatures would own 1/3 of the franchise rights. And so finally, in 1996, Game Freak released Pokémon Red and Green in Japan. It was a sleeper hit that took some time before it became a global phenomenon. In this game, you play as a young trainer who travels across the Kanto region, catching wild creatures and training them to battle other trainers, with the goal of defeating 8 gym leaders and becoming the champion. It had 151 Pokémon. At the time, the RPG market was dominated by Dragon Quest, which was huge in Japan, but had failed badly in the West. Pokémon Red and Green had a slow start, but gradually built up popularity through word of mouth, becoming the best-selling games of 1997 in Japan, beating Final Fantasy VII. When the international versions came out, which were Pokémon Red and Blue in 1998, followed by Pokémon Yellow, they exploded. Pokémon Yellow with Pikachu as your only starter, just like in the anime, became the fastest selling Game Boy game ever, with 600,000 copies sold in just 1 week. Pokémon Yellow became the best-selling video game of 1999 in the US with 6.1 million copies sold. The first generation game's total sales are around 31 million copies, which is still the highest of all Pokémon generations as of 2026. Fun fact, Pikachu was really hard to get in the first game is because the designer liked the character so much that he wanted players to feel special when they caught one. Mew was a secret Pokémon, as the original Pokédex was supposed to only have 150 Pokémon, but a programmer managed to squeeze Mew into the leftover space. In 1998, the 3 companies, Nintendo, the publisher and distributor, Game Freak, the developer, and Creatures, the producer and manager, created the Pokémon Company to manage the brand together. Generation 2 begins with Gold and Silver at the turn of the millennium, but development started right after the release of Pokémon Red and Green in 1996, with initial plans to release them by 1998. They got delayed multiple times. The team had to rebuild part of the game when they decided to add the entire region of Kanto as the post-game area. They also had to work on the localization of Red and Blue for the West and develop the new games at the same time. Gold and Silver take place in a new region called Johto, with a new story and 100+ new Pokémon. There is also a day and night system, so different Pokémon appear at different times. You can also go back to Kanto after beating the game, which was mind-blowing for players at the time, and honestly still is. The game also added 2 new types, Steel and Dark. By 2000, Pokemon was very popular worldwide, with the games, the anime, and the trading cards. The only real competition was from Digimon, but Pokemon managed to stay dominant. The biggest challenge was fitting Kanto and Johto on a single Game Boy Color cartridge, which was 2 megabytes in size. They also got sidetracked working on Pokemon Stadium for the N64, which split resources. These games were received very well and highly praised, but some critics complained that they were very similar in structure to the first games, though surely they will innovate and change things and not stick to the same formula for decades, right? Anyway, Pokemon Crystal was released later on, set in the same region, with a female protagonist option for the first time, and some small improvements. Generation 3 began with the Ruby and Sapphire games, released in 2002, but there was a major problem. Right after Gold and Silver's release, people started saying the Pokemon craze was over, and it became a serious concern for the dev team. So they tried to push hard to create something that would prove doubters wrong. The Game Boy Advance's more powerful hardware allowed for better graphics but also required more work. The Ruby and Sapphire games were set in the Hoenn region and introduced 135 new Pokemon and a new story. We battled 2 rival teams, Team Magma and Ruby or Team Aqua and Sapphire, who are trying to awaken legendary Pokemon. Each Pokemon now also had a unique ability that affected its combat abilities. There was a nature system which boosted one stat and lowered another. They also introduced double battles, which would go on to become a core competitive feature. Emerald was released later and fixed many complaints and issues, becoming the definitive Gen 3 experience. Both evil teams appeared in Emerald, and you had to awaken a big green space noodle to stop them. And it also had the Battle Frontier as a post-game area. In 2002, the PS2 was dominant, and big franchises like GTA, Halo, and Final Fantasy were competing for attention, and Pokemon was seen as a dying franchise by some. However, Ruby and Sapphire proved the critics wrong, becoming the 2nd and 4th best-selling games of 2003 in the US. The games were received well for their graphics, new mechanics, and abilities, with a fresh story, selling over 1 million copies in the first week in Japan. Fun fact, this generation also had the Pokemon Contest minigame where you could make your Pokemon perform on stage instead of just battling. Generation 4 begins with the Diamond and Pearl games released in 2006, designed for the Nintendo DS. The original Diamond and Pearl were very slow because of poor programming, leading to a lot of waiting between turns and making battles take a long time. The Sinnoh Pokédex was also too small, forcing many new Pokemon evolutions to be unobtainable until after beating the game. But a lot of the issues were fixed by Platinum, which had redesigned areas, fixed battle animations, and expanded the Pokédex from 210 to 493. Diamond and Pearl took place in the Sinnoh region and introduced online features. You could trade and battle with players worldwide. The games added 107 new Pokemon and physical special split from moves, which classified moves as physical or special based on their attack type, not the move itself. This changed competitive Pokemon in a big way. Platinum, the 3rd version of this generation, is considered one of the best 3rd games ever made and is my personal favorite. It fixed almost everything wrong with Diamond and Pearl, improved the story, added more Pokemon to catch, and made the game much faster to play. Diamond and Pearl got mixed reviews. People liked the games, but they were criticized for being slow and having a limited Pokédex. Platinum was received a lot better because it fixed many of the issues people had with Diamond and Pearl and had an amazing storyline with Giratina, the first legendary Pokemon to have form changes. Generation 5 begins with Black and White in 2010. The team wanted to create a fresh experience by limiting players to new Pokemon, which was a risky choice. The idea was to give new Pokemon a fair chance to be appreciated instead of being compared to the old ones. The games are set in the Unova region, with only Gen 5 Pokemon appearing in the game. You couldn't use Pokemon from older generations until after beating the game. The games added 156 new Pokemon. These were also the first games to have direct named sequels, Black 2 and White 2, instead of a third version that combined the two versions. These new games were set 2 years later in the same region and added new Pokémon and an improved new storyline. The biggest challenge for the devs was to design 156 new Pokémon to fill all the roles that previous generations' Pokémons had filled. Some designs were criticized for being too similar to old Pokémon, like Pidove and Pidgeot. The team also had to create an engaging story without relying on nostalgia, which was hard, as some fans didn't like the new designs as much as the classics. The games had mixed reception, praised by critics for doing something new, but fans were divided, with many complaining that forcing only new Pokémon was too restrictive. Black 2 and White 2 fixed this by including old Pokémon from the start, making these games more popular. Despite this, Black and White were the fastest DS games to reach 5 million copies. Fun fact, these games featured changing seasons, a first for the series. Generation 6 features Pokémon X and Y, released in 2013, being the first Pokémon games on the Nintendo 3DS with full 3D graphics. Every Pokémon model was rendered in 3D instead of sprites. They introduced Mega Evolutions and also let you customize your character's appearance. The Kalos region, where these games were set, was based on France, and the story was about a villain trying to create an immortal Pokémon. These games were in development for 3.5 years, with over 500 people involved in their creation. And the jump to full 3D was a massive task, as they had to create new models for all 700 plus Pokémon, while pushing the 3DS's capabilities. This was also the first time Pokémon games released at the same time for both Japan and the rest of the world. The games were received very well with high scores at the time because of the 3D graphics, character customization, and Mega Evolutions. However, some felt the story was weak and the game was too easy because of Mega Evolutions, and that the region felt linear. Some say these games were the start of the franchise's decline, despite the praise at release. Generation 7 brings Pokémon Sun and Moon in 2016 for the 3DS, taking place in the Alola region, inspired by Hawaii. You take part in island challenges instead of collecting gym badges, a fresh departure from the traditional formula. The game also introduced Alolan forms of Pokémon, which were basically regional variants of old Pokémon, like the Ice-type Vulpix, and also introduced Z moves, which were powerful once per battle moves. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon were enhanced versions released a year later with a different story and additional features. The game was announced on Pokemon's 20th anniversary, and the team wanted to break away from the gym badge formula. They also removed HMs and replaced them with the Poké-Ride system, which meant you didn't need to have an HM Pokemon in your party for exploration. The game got positive reviews for trying something new and having a stronger story, but some complained about the small Pokédex with only 81 new Pokemon. Z moves are also overpowered and unbalanced at times, and the game was a lot more story heavy than previous games, which can be a pro or con depending on the player. Fun fact, Sun and Moon were the most pre-ordered games in Nintendo history at the time. This was also the first time Pokemon appeared in the overworld instead of only as random encounters in grass. Generation 8 brings Pokemon Sword and Shield in 2019 to the Nintendo Switch, taking place in the Galar region based on the United Kingdom. The game introduced a new mechanic called Gigantamax, similar to Mega Evolution, but this time any Pokemon could use it. And for the first time, not all Pokemon were in the game. The team had to learn new hardware and scale up the graphics. However, the yearly release schedule they had at the time meant they had a fast development cycle and not as much time compared to previous generations. The Switch was the most dominant console on the market, and these games had no real competition, becoming the biggest games of 2019 for many players on the system. While the game got generally positive reviews, the fanbase was divided over the removal of hundreds of Pokemons from the National Pokédex, something that came to be known as Dexit. Basically, Game Freak announced that not all Pokemon would be included, so they could focus on quality and graphical improvements. But fans noted the graphics weren't significantly better than previous games, and even starter Pokemon from earlier games were cut, which made fans furious. Classic Pokemon like Alakazam, Metagross, and Squirtle line were removed, and event-exclusive Pokemon couldn't be transferred. However, despite this controversy, the game sold massively and became the fastest selling Switch games at the time, selling around 26 million copies and becoming the third best selling Pokemon games. Generation 9 introduced Scarlet and Violet in 2022 for the Switch. They were the first fully open-world Pokemon games set in the region of Paldea. You could tackle the 3 story paths in any order you wanted: gym challenges, team star bases, or Titan Pokemon. They introduced a new mechanic, because of course they did, called terrestrialization, which turns a Pokemon's type into a Terra type. Depending on which Terra type the Pokemon has, you can change its typing in the middle of a fight. This game also had visible Pokemon in the open world, so you could see what you were catching before battling. The team redesigned Pokemon models to fit a new art style that was more realistic, while keeping character designs stylized. However, the 1-year development cycle was extremely rushed, and the quality of the game suffered as a result. Game Freak struggled with 3D game development. They wanted to create a proper open world with 3 story paths, a new art style, new Pokemon models, and new mechanics in just 1 year. The result of this huge scope in such a short timeline was a game that felt unfinished at launch. The game had and still has severe frame rate drops, low resolution textures and lazy tiling, long draw distances with rough graphics, abundant bugs and glitches, animation issues, and a world design that often felt empty. These games had a mixed to negative critical reception, being some of the lowest scored mainline Pokemon games. However, despite the criticism from many users with the game, fans noted that they were at least trying something new rather than sticking to the old gym badge formula. And this was probably the most ambitious Pokemon game ever attempted. As shown by its sales, Scarlet and Violet sold about 27.6 million copies as of late 2025, making them the second best-selling games in the Pokemon franchise, only behind the first generation games. And that is the story of the Pokemon video game franchise. Spin-offs and legend titles were not covered here because that would make the video way too long. Maybe for another video. Let me know if you want to see that. I am Darky, thanks for watching.